Hi, fourth graders. It's Miss Leanne. We are on to the next step in our learning for the Historical Fiction Book Club. Today, we're going to be looking at significant parts in the story, and we're going to be thinking about how there are certain parts that are important to the whole story. So when we talk about part to whole, we're going to look at one specific part, and we're going to think about how that one part lends into the bigger idea or the theme in the story. I want you to think about the book Tiger Rising. We read this at the beginning of the year. And in Tiger Rising, there were parts that made us think of a deeper level. It made us think about the real heart of the story. And I have talked before with you guys about the different symbols that we kind of touched upon in the book. So we know that there's a tiger locked in a cage, and we know that Rob has this suitcase that he puts his feelings in. And in that unit, we talked about what that really stood for, the tiger being locked in a cage and that metaphorical suitcase, because that's not a real suitcase, it's a metaphor of a suitcase and what he keeps putting in there. So in this story, there's a part I would like to talk to you a little bit about, so that way we can think about what significance this part plays in the whole story of Tiger Rising. So here we go. I can tell you how to cure that, said Willie Mae, pointing her cigarette at his legs. I can tell you right now. Don't need to go to no doctor. Huh? Said Rob. He stopped chewing his gum and held his breath. What if Willie Mae healed him and then he had to go back to school? Sadness, she said Willie Mae, closing her eyes and nodding her head. You keeping all that sadness down low in your legs. You're not letting it get up to your heart where it belongs. You got to let that sadness rise on up. So when I look at that part, when I have read Tiger Rising, it just kind of stands out to me and kind of alerts me. And it kind of connects me back to those parts where I've talked about that suitcase, about that tiger being locked in the cage. And I'm just kind of like, wow, here is another example of something being trapped, something being kept somewhere. And it's that what Willie Mae identifies as his sadness. He's keeping the sadness locked into his body down low in his legs. And please remember, in his legs is where he has this rash, right? And so in his legs, she is equating that rash to the sadness. So I think what this part is really about is really calling upon this sadness that Rob has within him. And that sadness came from the fact that his mother had passed away. It's something that he's not really dealing with. And we see that reoccurring whenever he thinks about mom, he kind of just stops, right? Whenever he's being picked on, he just blocks it all out. He's just not dealing with any emotions. So to make sure that we are doing a good job while we are reading, we need to start looking for some clues that suggest a passage is worth thinking more about. Remember, when you're reading your story, it's not just going to have these big flashing lights or this part that says, hey, listen, look, this is a really important part. You should really pay attention right now. That's not how this is going to work. What you're going to need to do is read very closely. I've talked a lot about that. We're not just kind of flipping through the book, all kind of lackadaisical. We're really focusing in on these details that the author is taking the time to write about. So when you're noticing and you're reading, if there is an image or if there is a word that is repeated often, it might be a symbol of something bigger. Just like in Tiger Rising, they kept speaking about that tiger locked in a cage and his rash and about that suitcase. Those were symbols for something bigger. So you're going to notice if there's an image or a word that is repeated often, it might be a symbol of something bigger. And they have a picture right here of a cupcake and the no crossed through it. Thinking about that when we're reading Number the Stars, why would they keep pointing out this cupcake? I know so far that we've heard about this cupcake at least probably 3 times minimum, about these cupcakes that were not available to them with the pink frosting. We need to think about and notice if something catches us by surprise or stands out. Think about why might the author have put in this surprising part? Why? Just like it was surprising that the German soldiers had stopped the girls while they were running. It's surprising that Mrs. Hirsch's button shop was closed. It was surprising, when Peter stopped by in the middle of the night. Things that don't typically happen that kind of give you pause. And you're like, interesting. And then you notice if a new insight dawns on your character. Your character is figuring something out that they had not noticed before, but now they're noticing. So that's kind of a time that you're going to want to give yourself a little bit more thought about what's going on in your reading. I'm going to go ahead and read an excerpt of chapter 3 from Number the Stars. And we're going to kind of look for these parts that are pause-worthy parts, parts that give us a little bit of a clue that we should think a little bit more about what's going on in the story. So here we go. Anne-Marie was almost asleep when there was a light knock at the bedroom door. Candlelight appeared as the door opened, and her mother stepped in. "Are you asleep, Anne-Marie?" "No. Why? Is something wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, but I'd like you to get up and come out into the living room. Peter's here. Papa and I want to talk to you." Anne-Marie jumped out of bed and Kirsty grunted in her sleep. Peter! She hadn't seen him in a long time. There was something frightening about his being here at night. Copenhagen had a curfew, and no citizens were allowed out after 8 o'clock. It was very dangerous, she knew, for Peter to visit at this time, but she was delighted that he was here. Though his visits were always hurried, they almost seemed secret somehow, in a way she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, it was a treat to see Peter. So I want you guys to think about that a little bit more. That is the something's happening that doesn't usually happen, right? Why is this happening? So I'm going to go ahead and continue reading a little bit more in this chapter about some things that stand out to us. And Peter says, "For your mama and papa, I brought something more practical, 2 bottles of beer." Mama and Papa smiled and raised their glasses. Papa took a sip and wiped it, foam from his upper lip. His face became more serious. "Anne-Marie," he said, "Peter tells us that the Germans have issued orders closing many stores run by Jews." "Jews?" Anne-Marie repeated. "Is Mrs. Hirsch Jewish? Is that why the button shop is closed? Why have they done that?" Peter leaned forward. "It is their way of tormenting. For some reason, they want to torment the Jewish people. It has happened in other countries. They have taken their time here, have let us relax a little. But now, it seems to be starting." "But why the button shop? What harm is a button shop? Mrs. Hirsch is such a nice lady. Even Samuel, he's a dope, but he would never harm anyone. How could he? He can't even see with his thick glasses." Then Anne-Marie thought of something else. If they can't sell their buttons, how will they earn their living? "Friends will take care of them," Mama said gently. "That's what friends do." So I want you guys to really take pause and pay attention to this part. Friends will take care of them, Mama said gently. That's what friends do. How does this part connect to earlier parts? How does this part tell you what the story is really about? You need to make sure that you're keeping this part put away in your mind, because as you're reading, this part can come back and really tie into the overall theme about Peter being there late at night, them thinking about how they are shutting down the shop. thinking about the damage that it is doing to the families, the Jewish families, and then friends taking care of each other. So, in the next part of our lesson, I want to think of another part that kind of stood out to me. And again, it's kind of reflecting back to one of those symbols or those repeated things. Um, Remember when Anne Marie and Ellen were kind of looking at each other? They were walking home from school, and this was a different day than the first day. Anne Marie and Ellen exchanged looks that meant, Kirsty is so dumb. No one in Copenhagen had taken a vacation to the seashore since the war began. There were no pink frosted cupcakes. There hadn't been for months. What is that part really about? Not taking vacations, not having pink frosted cupcakes. I want you guys to think a little bit more about how the lack of vacations and the lack of something as simple as a frosted cupcake is no longer available to them. So again, as we are doing our reading, please take note of these more significant parts and how they lend to the overall theme of the story.